So thank you everyone for joining our webinar today on how to maximise your presence at cybersecurity trade shows. I'm Katie Finn, Strategic Director at Eskenzi, and I'll be your chair for today's panel. For those of you not familiar with Eskenzi, we're a dedicated cybersecurity and technology PR agency with a presence in the US, UK, France and Germany. During the course of our 28-year history, we've helped increase visibility for companies at and around all of the key cybersecurity trade shows, as well as leading PR campaigns for some of the shows themselves. This includes leading the PR program for Infosecurity Europe for nearly 2 decades, supporting countless clients at RSA, driving an award-winning PR campaign for International Cyber Expo. And as a result, we've seen firsthand how impactful trade shows can be at fueling business growth and what makes a successful event comms strategy. For many cybersecurity companies, as I'm sure lots of you on the line would agree, the trade show calendar can help to define corporate communications agendas. Organisations will often look to build a programme of communications around those North Star trade shows such as RSA, Infosecurity Europe, Black Hat and International Cyber Expo, using the shows to launch new products, research and news, while the eyes of the media and analysts are all focused on one place. But in parallel with trade shows representing a sizable budget item, companies are understandably keen to leverage media and analyst relations to get the most out of their investment in events. We see time and time again that securing coverage in the run-up to an event, for example, can drive traffic to your stand, can increase those lead gen opportunities, can be really instrumental at boosting your market visibility, supporting talent acquisition, increasing customer and partner engagement, and also leveraging events to meet with IT security analysts such as yourself, Rick, can be really instrumental at building relationships between your company and some of the most influential people in the industry who hold significant sway over cybersecurity purchasing decisions. But one thing that we were just discussing before we got started today was that since the pandemic, certainly on the PR side, we've seen that media and analyst interactions at shows have changed, and engaging influencers has become more challenging than ever. So to help us understand this landscape and to delve into how companies can make the most of their presence at cybersecurity trade shows, we brought together a fantastic panel of speakers who I'm delighted to introduce you to today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So just to let you know, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please drop them into the chat throughout the discussion and we'll make sure that we have time to answer them at the end. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to our fantastic panel of speakers today. So we have Beth Maundrill, editor at Infosecurity magazine. Beth joined the team in August 2022 and has spent her career dedicated to business journalism. She took to the world of cybersecurity in 2021 and is now at the helm of one of the world's most influential cybersecurity publications. I'm also joined by Rick Turner, Senior Principal Analyst at Omdia, specialising in cybersecurity technology trends. Rick provides analysis and insights on market evolution and helps end users determine what type of technology and which vendor they should pursue. Prior to joining Omdia, Rick works as an IT journalist specialising in networking and security, and was also a foreign correspondent in Brazil, where he worked for, among others, the Financial Times and The Economist. Delighted to have you with us, Rick, and fantastic that you've seen both the press and analyst side of things as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can honestly sing with Joni Mitchell that I've looked at IT from both sides now.
I love that, and we'll absolutely have that song in my head all day. And from the US, I'm pleased to introduce John Petrik, a writer and editor specialising in cybersecurity, who served as the founding editor of Cyberwire from September 2012 through to January of this year. Before Cyberwire, he works as the corporate marketing director and on the staff of government, science and technology organisations. So again, bringing some multiple different perspectives to our discussion today.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.
And last but certainly not least, I'm joined by Eskenzi PR account director Connor Heslin, who's worked across a wide range of cybersecurity clients in his 7 years at Eskenzi, as well as representing them at major trade shows such as Infosecurity Europe, International Cyber Expo and RSA.
Thanks, Katie. Good to be here.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining the line. Thought a great place for us to start. As we touched upon in the introduction, from our side, it seems like trade shows have changed a lot in the past few years, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. Do you think the effect of the pandemic is still being felt? Perhaps Rick, would you like to start with that one?
I suppose it's waning in as much as certainly at the height, 2020, 21, events went entirely virtual for obvious reasons, which was quite horrible, actually. Firstly, because it meant that you never got to stretch your legs. You literally were all the time talking to endless people in normally 1 hour or 45-minute conversations on countless Zoom calls. Then they went back to being kind of hybrid. And I remember in the case of Infosecurity, I remember I'd planned to go to the first one when it was back face to face. And there was a strike of all of the transport. So it was going to be a nightmare for me to get there. And then an even worse nightmare to get across London to the Excel where in order to get in and see it. So we gave up on that and decided instead to continue doing it virtually, which was absolutely horrible because it meant that you were talking to people inside really loud, really sort of really difficult spaces because people were sitting in the mid on their stand in the middle of Infosecurity trying to talk to you in a Zoom call. It was awful. Now I'm glad to say we are back to face. And the other one of the other branches of the Informer group that also owns Omdia is Black Hat, and they've been doing stellar performance again now that people are coming back and are keen to meet face to face. So yeah, it looks to me at least as if the worst impact of the pandemic has passed, and folks are getting back to meeting face to face and drinking beer and coffee and things we always did at Infosecurity.
I think
John,
I think one change that we've seen is that shows all now routinely have a virtual component, a strong virtual component.
Oh yeah.
That the pandemic forced people to figure out how to do that. And they've learned that. And that I think is not going to go away. I think it's not now driven by health concerns, but this is simply another way people have figured out of delivering content and collaboration opportunities. So that I think is one enduring change that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I would just
agree with that. Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
Well, I was just going to add to that. I think that it was a bit of a slow return to events after the pandemic, and even in 2022 and perhaps early 2023, people were still a little uncertain. I'd say events are really strongly back now, though, and also what I'm finding is my interactions with companies outside of the events are increasing, so more bespoke briefings, people being invited to those. I get asked quite a lot, oh, if we did a briefing ahead of InfoSec, would you come? And I think that will be something we talk about a little bit later, but I think there's definitely a lot more opportunity around the shows as well, as people are more willing to get out and about now. So I think we can kind of say there have been some changes, but ultimately the idea that people don't want to go to face-to-face events is not come to fruition.
Yeah, we
I
attended
agree with that.
Cloud and Cyber Expo last week, and certainly on the first day of the show it was absolutely packed. Couldn't move for people. Similarly with International Cyber Expo last year, so great to see that return to form. Connor, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think everything that all of the other panelists have said is correct about trade shows, but I think that the competition that people are now seeing to, make sure that when they do attend these shows, they're being as, everything's as competitive as it can be, and they have an edge on everybody else who's kind of at these shows is really important as well, I think. I think that seems to have become even more of a differentiator since the pandemic, for people to be drawn in by, particularly enticing stands or something interesting or all of those kind of things, I do think have become more important. And I guess that is part of what we've been talking about, that they also now, as well as competing with all of the organizations who are, at the trade show, they're also competing with the hybrid element of the trade show, and they're competing with people who can get this news or you know, get information about their company elsewhere. So I think people are really trying to make sure that they, you know, make themselves seen as much as possible at these shows more than ever.
What I would like to ask you, Con, if I may, is whether or not you have seen any reluctance on the part of any of your customers, any of your clients, to actually return, not on the basis of, you know, oh, I might get COVID, but rather on the basis of, my God, it's so expensive. Because one thing that's unquestionably the case is that hotel prices have gone through the roof, and people in the hotels immediately around all of the venues are really gouging. I know they've got to make up for lost time, but my God, it's got expensive to stay anywhere near any of these venues.
So I haven't noticed, I mean, the hospitality element is a really good point, I think, but I don't think I've noticed particularly people saying on a cost view that they're not going to return. I think people are still used to, as Katie quite rightly said in her intro, they're still used to building those corporate communications around these shows, and people still treat them as, you know, anchors in the year where, you know, a program of news or all of that kind of stuff still relates to this. So I think, broadly speaking, I think people are still getting out there, and it speaks to the kind of resilience people have for face-to-face meetings that Beth touched on.
Yeah, and I would just add onto the virtual element. If I'm planning our coverage of a trade show and a company says, we're not actually going to be there, but we're going to do some virtual briefings around it, I would not prioritize that company. I will always prioritize the ones that are physically there, because those are the ones we can speak to, and the virtual element can be done another time. So it's about managing the time that we have. So the virtual element comes in really handy throughout the whole year, but during the actual show, those 3 days or 4 days, whichever event it is, I wouldn't be sitting through a virtual, I'd be very reluctant to sit for a virtual briefing when I'm physically at an event. I think I have had a couple of invites in the past, but I think that's something to just think about in terms of when using virtual is the best time to kind of do so.
I think to come back to your point, Rick, something that we're seeing across the board is the real need to demonstrate ROI from everything that we're doing from a marketing and comms perspective, and that extends to events as well. So where companies are investing in events, it's just all about, okay, what can we be doing to support them to really make sure that they see it as a valuable investment, that they get the most out of it, and then even if the associated costs for other third-party accommodation and things like that have increased, they still see it as a really valuable investment.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? There's almost a reverse psychology going on as well, in as much as even after the pandemic and now that things are starting to come back, there's also this thing of, can you afford not to be at RSA or at Black Hat or whatever that your conference of choice is? I mean, it's been very notable since basically since Symantec was acquired by Broadcom, that their stands have either shrunk to be insignificant, or they've just disappeared altogether. Which, okay, that's Broadcom's general strategy, I suppose, is like, let's focus down on just the top 1,000 clients and not worry about, you know, blowing our trumpet to the world. But it certainly does not go unnoticed amongst the chattering classes, of which all three of us, me, Beth, and John, definitely are participants. And the chattering classes of IT, all in the bar, are saying, have you noticed who's not here? Well, Symantec's not here, and, you know, blah, blah. So that kind of thing also has a fallout that maybe the skids are under, and maybe it's the beginning of the end, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And to come back then to the shows this year, so John, from a journalist perspective, what are you most interested in covering? And when you're going to trade shows, do you have a set agenda from an editorial perspective? Do you want to pre-pitch? Do you go to the show and just see what you can discover?
Well, trade shows are always, a lot of your activity at a trade show is opportunistic, if only because trade shows resemble nothing so much as an adult form of trick-or-treating. You walk around from booth to booth, picking up pens and bags and things like that. But I think that it's important when you're going to a trade show as a vendor, as a company, to understand how much of the coverage that emerges from trade shows is opportunistic. That you'll go in with an interest in pursuing certain topics with a small set of certain questions, but you may not wind up writing about any of those. You will spend, I've always found myself spending a lot of time talking to industry representatives. And that sometimes those conversations are surprising and interesting, and they're almost always at least pleasant, you know. So there's be open to that kind of serendipitous encounter at the shows. I think for the trade shows this year, what are some of the trends that I would be interested in following? I think there are two in general, and some of this is will represent an editorial bias because it's the sort of thing that I was writing about and that we're covering. But one trend is, the obvious trend is AI. So I won't even address that. You're all aware of that. You'll all be prepared to talk about it. Another one that I think is not talked about as much, but that I think in some ways is even more interesting, is what I'll just call convergence. That there are a lot of topics in cybersecurity and a lot of areas and subdisciplines within cybersecurity that are converging with older areas and disciplines. Cybersecurity, for example, is, I think, converging with electronic warfare when you look at state-to-state conflict. And there are things going on in cybersecurity that really represent just a transposition of older traditional electronic warfare disciplines. What is DDoS, for example, other than a new form of jamming? You know, what is a keylogger other than a new form of network intrusion? So these things are old and they're familiar. Cyber is also converging with traditional influence operations, you know, with marketing and battle dress. So I think it's always illuminating and helpful if you can see how something that appears to be new is in fact a development, is in fact not as new as you might think. There's one other question that I think is being answered that a lot of people have been asking over the last 10 years, which is how do governments, how do states take advantage of additional capacity when they need it for cyber defense? And I think the I think Russia's war in Ukraine has shown two models of that. The Ukrainians have a clear auxiliary model of augmenting their forces, where they are using essentially volunteers in the cyber army of Ukraine to provide defensive services and some offensive services. The Russians have a very different model, which is basically the co-option of organized criminals to work for them. So those are some interesting themes that I would be interested in hearing about this year.
Really, really interesting. And Beth, how about you? What are you particularly looking to cover at trade shows this year?
Yeah, so I was just going to talk a little bit about how we approach it, and I would agree with John. A lot of it is opportunistic. I'm very lucky that I have a small team and then some freelance support when we cover the big trade shows. So there'll be like a minimum story requirement from the freelancers. With my team, it's a mix. It's like, well, write maybe 2 stories, 3 stories a day. I never tell them specifically. Maybe we'll have like some broad themes. Okay, this AI, let's dive into these topics. So we'll have discussions, but a lot of it is, as John kind of outlined, opportunistic. And we also like to start our coverage for some of the bigger events in the days before, so that we're getting that traction on our website as people are starting to talk about the event and plan what they're doing, and we're giving them a little bit of exposure. So I think and I'll mention this probably a couple of times, but that you can get in touch with us before the event, and we don't have to just wait for kind of D-Day, so to speak. In terms of what's new, I was just thinking then when John was speaking, I think over the last few years we've had a lot of key events, global events that have driven the conversation. So we had COVID, then the war in Ukraine, obviously that drove a lot of the conversation around cyber, around critical national infrastructure. Then we had AI, which is definitely something people are still talking about. What we want to hear about with that is, okay, this time last year we were talking about all the threats and issues. Are we seeing some solutions emerging? Is there solutions to stop AI model hacking and the social engineering that's being advanced by AI. How are we preventing that? So the next step of that story. And also, so what's the next big thing? I know these big events are sometimes very difficult to predict, but what's next? What's coming? So we're always looking for the new issue, but also trying to crack the code on some of the most talked about issues as well. So cybersecurity awareness training, anything that's actionable for CISOs. And we think about our readership when we're covering the shows as well. So what do they want to learn from the experiences that we're having and the people we're talking to, that they can actually take back to their businesses, as we are a trade publication, and actually say, I read this article on InfoSec and this has inspired me to tackle this challenge in this way.
Fantastic. Rick, from your perspective covering trade shows, how does it differ now that you're an analyst from your journalist days?
Well, obviously, one of the big differences is that as a journalist, I was out there to get information, which I would then go to, and I was daily journalist writing about IT rather than a weekly or monthly one, which meant that I was very much after a piece of news which I could then immediately publish, or maybe it was the next day if it was on paper, but increasingly it was electronic, and so it would be within a matter of hours. And there was an element of, I mean, obviously people told you stuff that was off the record, and you respected that, otherwise you didn't get very far in journalism. But there was kind of a feeling that, right, he has not said this is off the record, therefore I am okay to go out and say this. I don't need to go back and check it with him. I'm certainly not going to run my text by him before I publish. And I don't want to call it publish and be damned, but you know what I mean. There was very much that feel like, right, if I've sat down with this bloke and he's told me something and he hasn't specifically said, I'm sorry, that's either NDA or completely off the record. If neither of those have been the case, then I'm going to publish and I'm going to put the inverted commas and attribute it to him. If, on the other hand, he said, well, I'm afraid it's NDA, I will just say, oh, well, sector sources have suggested that, or something like that. That is more nuanced, I would say, as an analyst, for a couple of reasons. One, because the companies expect you to be more respectful of the information they're giving you. They are aware they're not talking to a journalist, they're now talking to an analyst, which means that they half expect you to be, I wouldn't say on their side, but at the very least, that you're not out there to merely to pick up information and get it to your subscribers or your readers. It's more complicated than that. And of course, one of the factors is that that a lot of the companies are themselves, the analyst firms, customers. Ergo, they are your subscribers as well as being your sources of information, which gets complicated. But anyway, I mean, it's something that you learn how to navigate.
Well, like I need to do the PR PSA here of just treat everything as on the record, always.
Well, yeah, I will say, I will say that my best interviews as a journalist, and indeed, I can't call them an interview anymore. I have to remember to call them a briefing nowadays that I'm an analyst, but forget it, whatever. But the best conversations I've had have been with where there was either no PR person riding shotgun, or if they were there, they knew me well enough to know, okay, Rick's all right. You can go ahead and tell him what you like, and he's not going to drop you in it, kind of thing. But it's obviously it's because we developed a relationship over any number of years for them to do that, you know. And I perfectly understand they've got to mind their clients, because some of the clients are truly, I won't say abysmal, but extraordinarily naive about the kind of stuff that they can say.
That's really good insights, and I would also say the other PR perspective certainly speaks to the importance of media training as well. So we talked a little bit about how people engage you in advance of an event. If the company's looking to meet with you at the show, what stands out to you as a good pitch? John, perhaps you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think the kind of pre-show briefing that's interesting. I think there's one rule to bear in mind when you're pitching a journalist, and that is you want to have something to say as opposed to merely something to sell. Okay. There's a place to have that sales conversation, but that's what ads are for. That's what sponsored content is for. So have something to say. And with that, the most interesting pre-show contacts I've had have been someone either just simply telling me, hey, I'll be at this show, come by and visit. That's fine. The more extensive contact would be someone who's effectively offering me a story under embargo. We plan to introduce this product at the show. Would you be interested in receiving a briefing on it under embargo? And we can talk about it. Then you can release when the embargo lifts. That's interesting, and that we can work with. That receiving things under embargo makes it easy to cover the material. Post-show briefings, if they're simply reflections on the show, those probably are not that interesting. But if you get to know someone at the show itself, you may well have ongoing topics of interest to discuss.
What pitches stand out to you?
So for me, I would agree with John. Make sure you've got something to say, not just someone will be at the show, because lots of people will be at the show and the event. So make sure you've got something to say, and make sure that you know what people are going to be available as well. So think about the publication you're talking to and who the relevant spokesperson for that publication would be. I think we accept copy under embargo as well, and we'll always respect that embargo, and that really helps us with our planning and might actually help you guarantee some coverage. Because if you send a press release to me on day 2 of Infosec and I've never seen it before, I am probably not going to read it. It's going to get lost in all the emails that are building up. Also, we're open to pre-event briefings, so even in like the month before, if you have time and you have people available, that is a really good idea, rather than saving it for those critical 3 days that everyone is time poor, really. Because as Rick alluded to when he was a journalist, you're filing copy on the day, the next day. So not only are you planning in your briefing time, you're also planning in your writing time. And as much as we can avoid it, we try not to be in our hotel rooms at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night still writing, although sometimes that does still happen. So really think about that pre-event planning, how you can engage with us, and even just saying, hello, I'm this person and I represent these people. Because if the first time I hear from you is just a blank, a mass email press release, that might not even catch my eye, because I won't know who these people are, what they're talking about. And as I said, as we get towards the events, we become quite time poor. The other thing I would say to avoid, and I do get quite a lot of these throughout the year, is the come and have a coffee with our CEOs, whoever, about what am I getting out of this? Sometimes I do feel like it's, we're under pressure to get this person in front of media, and that becomes quite obvious sometimes. So try and avoid that. Make sure you've got a clear message, you know what they're going to talk about, you are able to communicate with the journalist what they're going to talk about, and there's no confusion as well. I've had that happen before. But yeah, definitely pre-event planning. And if you don't get coverage during the show, if you've made an impact by speaking to that journalist, getting through in whatever way you've been able to, as John kind of said at the end of his comments, that can lead to longer conversations in the future, which can be part of your year-long plan, really, rather than just saying we need to get all this coverage during Infosec or during RSA. Actually, if you've got a 365-day year plan, which most people will have, think about, how am I going to connect with this journalist and get them to then write about me again in November and January, and keep that conversation going. So probably a lot of different points in that may not necessarily have answered the question directly, but just a few things to consider when you're pitching to journalists.
I think that's such an important point, and is something that we always talk about, and really that importance of maintaining a steady drumbeat of visibility throughout the year, and not just those peak moments, particularly when it is so competitive for airtime. So Connor, what advice would you give to companies that do want to generate media coverage and that are looking to really get that all-round visibility but don't have hard news that they can leverage?
Yeah, it's a really good point and a really good question. I think obviously, you know, sort of things like, you know, threat research and stuff like that are going to be really valuable for journalists, but we understand that they're quite advanced things to produce for a lot of organizations. There might be smaller teams who aren't working with the full sort of research division of their company, etc., and can't produce that. So we'd always advocate, you know, making sure that you've got a really strong thought leadership platform going throughout the year. As Beth mentioned, the first contact you make with a journalist shouldn't be in the run-up to a trade show. Whether a product launch and something like that might be around a trade show, but making sure that you've got those connections, you know, throughout the year, you're doing the kind of rapid response commentary, you're talking about industry issues, you know what your, you know, key authority position is on various cybersecurity issues, and you're able to kind of speak to them effectively. All of those kind of things are really important. There's also room for, you know, utilizing the show itself to create some hard news, which we've done in the past. So, you know, off the stand surveys, pardon me, is something we've done in the past for clients who can, you know, it's a good way to generate a survey of security professionals without paying, you know, the market research or analyst firm costs that are, you know, some organizations find a little bit more difficult to find as well. And that's another good reason to get back in touch after the show with people like Beth and John and say, hey, we were at Infosecurity, we didn't get a chance to speak at the show, but we did manage to find out, you know, some really interesting opinions from people who attended, and this is what we think about them. So all of those kind of things are really important. And yeah, I think saying something, not saying something for the sake of it, as Beth alluded to as well, and, you know, not just saying we're here and we'd love to have a conversation, because everybody wants that, and it's going to be really, really competitive to do so. So thinking about your timing, thinking about the show, you know, 3, 4, 5 months before the day is really important, and yeah, trying to build that kind of consistent drip of thought leadership and engagement with journalists throughout the year is really important. And that can also take place on social as well, which I know we'll touch on a little bit later, but social is a really good place to do that and think about those conversations too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on there, Connor, to the point you made about the surveys that you conducted through the event. And I was one of the recipients of that press release, and we did actually cover it. So just wanted to highlight how it works. And also, we're looking to cover the industry all the time, every day. For our publication, we don't just cover the events, we're covering everything every day. So if you can, in a couple of weeks after the event, say, look, here's some new news, then that does stand out to us as well, because those events are so busy and our inboxes get so full that actually thinking about if you have the opportunity to do something like that, I think is a really good strategy, actually.
For sure. I guess it's a really good litmus test for these trends that we talk about as well. You know, one of the first questions Katie asked of everyone on the panel was, what trends are we expected to see? If you can, you know, refer back to data from the previous year's show and say, this is a trend we have concrete evidence about from RSA or Infosec or wherever it may be, then you can make a kind of good inference about where that's going to go from the next year. So yeah, really important.
And that creates a news story by doing something repetitively. So this year compared to this year compared to this year, for us, that creates a nice news angle as well. I guess it's thinking about what's the angle here. So if you were in the journalist mind, how would I write this story? Maybe myself and my colleagues on the call find that quite an easy thing to think about, but definitely having the journalist in mind when you're putting that information together.
Absolutely. Thinking backwards from the headline is how we always try and do it as PR people.
and finding ways that we can make any research that we're developing as topical as possible as well. I know we were discussing it just before we went live, but when it is so noisy and it is so competitive, and now everyone is putting out research, you can't just create a research angle that's going to speak to why people need your solutions, because that's just going to come across as really self-serving and boring. So it's actually, how can we be aligning it with a bigger news story and a bigger societal trend that's going to make something that will be interesting.
Yeah, so it might be just useful to kind of highlight that as in terms of the noise, because we've mentioned it a few times now, and I don't want people on the call to just say, oh, they're just saying it's noisy, but what does that mean? So when the Lockbit law enforcement takedown happened, the morning of that takedown, I think by around 11 midday, I had emails from 16 different PR companies with comments from about 20 to 25 different individuals. So you can see how noisy it is, and how you then have to make the decision of, right, okay, do I know these people? Are they reliable sources? That kind of filters it out. Have they got something interesting to say? Are they just saying what everyone else is saying? So I just want to kind of raise that in terms of, we talk about noise, that's just one day, and that's one morning and one story. So kind of just gives a bit of perspective, hopefully. I did count, I counted them all at the end of the day. I was like, I'd be interested to know how much information we were sent, and it was a lot.
If I could add to Beth's comment, the you will receive a lot of comments on something like Lockbit. That I had a similar experience. From my point of view, that could be a problem at times, but it was a good kind of problem to have. That's relevant. It's often interesting. It's not bad. The stuff that I have always found very, very noisy are the lengthy offers to introduce me to your charismatic new CEO. That anything that's personality based strikes me as pure noise. I just have to be sure that there's nothing there that I don't think there's anything there I'm interested in, but I have to read it to make sure. So I would steer away from that. I would steer away from anything that is a pure sales pitch. And I would steer away from, in the pitch itself, from a wordy lead-in. That a lot of undergraduates in their composition courses receive advice that your first sentences should draw the reader in. That's probably not a good idea, okay? That leads to pitches that start, it's said that cybersecurity is a team sport, and that there are two kinds of companies, those who have been hacked and those who are going to be hacked. I don't want to have to read through that stuff. Just tell me what it is you want to say, and we'll move on from there.
Cybersecurity is an ever-evolving landscape. Right. It's on the avoid list. Yeah, I think when I spoke about noise in terms of the Lockbit stuff, it just was to highlight really how it's very competitive for those that are on the call as well. But I would agree with John's analysis of those kind of soft pitches, sales pitches, and wordy pitches. I won't. A lot of the time, I will judge a pitch based on the subject line of the email as well. That is obviously something that happens. So it's, how do you get that information in front of someone that quickly?
That's such a good point. We always think that opportunities are won and lost in 9 words, and it's, how can you convey it as impactfully and as succinctly as possible, particularly in the subject line. Connor, just to come back to your point there about social media, what advice would you give to companies that are looking to leverage social media, and I'm thinking particularly LinkedIn, to support their presence at events?
Yeah, and obviously LinkedIn is the one that you would be focusing on. Really, it's the most professional service social media. It's the one where journalists and journalist publications and vendors are all going to be looking at in advance of trade shows and throughout the year. And I think that throughout the year is a really crucial part of the social media conversation, that you should be posting relevant news on social media and engaging with other people's relevant news and engaging with the right people, whether that's journalists, other vendors, other people in the industry, influencers, etc., throughout the year. It shouldn't be a sort of big jump into lots and lots of engagement in the kind of week before a trade show, when, as we've all alluded to, it's already very, very busy on everybody's schedules and platforms, etc. So you need to be starting those conversations earlier and continuing those conversations throughout the year, during trade shows, after trade shows, etc. And I think the key thing there is conversations. So social media, obviously, a lot of it is about transmitting effectively and, you know, getting your news out there. But if you can also engage in a dialogue, that gives you an opportunity and another platform for some of these thought leadership conversations I was just talking about. If you can be commenting on industry trends, if you can be commenting on, you know, important bits of news, you know, the Lockbit takedown springs to mind. If people can be giving their opinions on LinkedIn, which lots of people were, you know, journalists and PR people and everybody else do notice that kind of thing, and they do notice people who are active and have those kind of opinions. So social media can be a really good and really cost-effective way, obviously, for a lot of organizations who are sort of, you know, closer to the beginning of their journey, and, you know, might not have the same resources to put behind a lot of kind of activity to make sure that you can still get your voice heard and you know, generate those opinions. And all of those things don't, you know, exist in a vacuum. They're always used and noticed by everybody who's engaging with them.
I think just to add on to that, Connor, about having people commenting on coverage of different events on social media, that's from a person's perspective, so not from your brand account. So those key spokespeople that you have that you would send me comment, they should also be making their own personal comment on social media, because we noticed that and we're like, well, so-and-so at so-and-so's company, he's always got something to say, and we notice it through the social media, maybe more than we do through the email. So still be cautious and think, are we saying something that's useful, adding to the conversation? But definitely having those individuals speaking on social media is something that we look at and we find interested, and then we connect with them. And if they say, please reach out via the press team, absolutely fine, we'll do so. So it's about positioning the people, not just the brand, because the people are your brand. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. And people do buy from people, as everybody knows, and people want to, they don't just want a sort of anonymous sort of cybersecurity company. They want it to be somebody who has an opinion and somebody who's gone out and, you know, started that company or is, you know, making a real contribution to that company. And, you know, those conversations definitely make a difference. And also they make a real difference in terms of the analytics on the social media side as well. If people are commenting on all of those stories, it pushes them up the algorithm effectively, and it, you know, helps people to see them, and it helps whoever you're commenting on, and it helps you to be more visible as well.
Yeah, and I think just bringing it back to the trade show conversation, less important during the event, because we don't have time to be scrolling through social media as much. So again, it's like bringing that plan forward the weeks ahead of the event. Are you talking to people? Are you reaching out? Those kind of things, definitely thinking about that.
And I think to that point about people buying people, using photos, even though LinkedIn is that sort of B2B platform, actually photos can really bring to life what you're doing if you do have a presence at an event. Even things like people going in and getting on a plane, it just helps people to connect with you and your brand and see the people behind the organization. Rick, how do you share Beth's opinion? You don't really use social media during events, or how can people best engage with you on social media surrounding trade shows?
Well, firstly, definitely LinkedIn is the one that I do use. I'm not particularly concerned. Once in a while, I'll do something actually during the event, but certainly ahead of the event, I'll aim to let people know that I'm going to be there. And of course, they can then reach out on a one-to-one basis, particularly if they're already linked to me anyway. But even not, they can ask to connect, and away we go. And yeah, let's arrange a conversation. You know, that's definitely the way that they can do it. And then, yeah, I'll tend to do, maybe I'll do something about what I'm going to be looking for at the upcoming event. And certainly, we normally try to do something straight after that says, oh, these are the main trends that we saw at the event, you know, just to sort of blow our own trumpet, really.
Excellent. And just before we open the floor to questions, what are your top tips for 2024's trade shows this year? Perhaps John, we can start with you.
I would be open to personal engagement on the show floor. I would think very hard about not wasting a reporter's time. And in your electronic communications with a media outlet, above all, don't come across like a catfish.
And Beth, your top tips?
Yeah, so similar to John, always open to speaking to people. That's both myself and my team at Infosecurity Europe or any of the other trade shows. We'll also be at RSA and Black Hat. But for our audience, just to summarize some of the points we've made during this session, make sure you have something new or interesting to say. Don't feel like you need to say something for the sake of it. Consider who is going to say it. So is this the right person for us to be putting in front of the media? Do they have the right expertise and background? Think about the timing. Are you sending that press release on the Monday before the event starts, or are you sending it a month in advance, trying to connect with the journalists? So think about that 365 days really of connection with journalists. And as always, Katie, I'm sure you will agree, wear comfy shoes.
Yes, best piece of advice you'll hear all webinar, I think. And Rick, your top tip.
Well, I have a particular bugbear actually about it, which is that towards the end or the latter period of a 3 or 4 day show, when I get the chance, what I'll do is I do a sort of a supermarket sweep round all of the stands to all of the companies that I'm interested in, because I've already made a mental note that I'm going to need to speak to these guys, but I haven't got any chance of having a conversation with them and fitting them in during the show. Now, I don't carry cards anymore. I gave up actually physical cards about 4 or 5 years ago, when I started noticing that every time I pulled a card out in California, everyone went, "My God, how quaint is that?" So I thought, no, okay, we're not going to bother with that. Just LinkedIn was all with me, they would always say. So I started doing that. But at the show, what I do is I always take my little badge, obviously, along, and say, look, do us a favor, mate. Would you mind scanning my badge and make a note that I want to talk to your AR people or your PR AR people or whatever, and make sure they get back to me. And they all religiously say, yeah, all right, mate, yeah, no problem. Well, look, and they scan it and it goes into their system. I would say probably no more than 30% of them actually get back to me. And I'm not doing it for my health, and I'm not doing it just to be sweet. I really do want to hear from them. Otherwise, I'm not going on their stand in the first place. So I really am interested in these people. The fact that I haven't spoken to them at the show, tough. I've got 50 other people chasing me per day. But if you could, if you see me and scan my card, for God's sake, get back to me and actually pursue me. And I don't mean send a salesman to see whether I want a demo of your product. I mean, get some bod that can actually tell me about the company, the technology, what it's doing, who it competes with, how it's different. And in other words, give me a proper briefing, because that's what I'm after. And then I'll write about you.
And that's so surprising, but also not at the same time. It's we see it when we'll go and walk the show floor, and we're obviously going in the capacity as PRs, and then the amount of people that will then follow up with a massive sales pitch, and it's like, we're sorry, we're not the right people. And if you're not scrutinizing who you're talking to, then you're not going to get the most out of the interactions that you have at the show.
Exactly.
Perfect. Well, there's some questions that have been dropped in the chat. So we had one from Gary Connor asking if you could give one piece of advice for a new security company with a limited budget, what would that be? Connor, I don't know if you had thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think we touched on some of these points already, but I think that use of social media and, you know, if you need to talk to people to be guided on that front, there's always people who can help. But, you know, using social media to really start building that thought leadership platform that can kind of be the springboard you can use into a potential kind of media strategy further down the line. You know, if we can already see that you're an active sort of participant in the industry and you talk to thought leadership topics thoughtfully, you're following the right people, you're engaging on the right subjects, you know, all of those kind of things can be a real differentiator for a small company. So I think, you know, some sort of savvy use of social media would probably be my big tip for a small organization or a newer organization.
A question away from the traditional trade shows like Black Hat, RSA, and Infosecurity Europe. Are there any newer ones that you'd recommend attending?
I think there's a lot of new events popping up in the cybersecurity space, and I think they're definitely worth visiting to suss out what value they give and what they bring. I won't name any in particular, but the thing is, those big events are those key linchpins, and that's what we've been kind of discussing. And when you don't necessarily have the time to be attending every single event, unfortunately, you will gravitate towards the big ones because you know you can speak to everyone, you can see everyone, whereas some of the smaller ones, they might have interesting conference programs or they might have some new element to them, but it's not quite enough to draw you there. That's from my perspective, just because of the sheer volume of events that are popping up, because we have not only got the like independent events, you've also got a lot of conferences that are springing up around that companies themselves are hosting, and they're inviting us to those as well. So there's a number of events, then there's a number of vendors that are doing their own events. So there's a lot going on in the year. So I think those key ones are just always going to be super important.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point to be made about the speaking side of things, actually. I think some of the smaller ones do have more capacity for sort of different aspects of, you know, security. I know the International Cyber Expo's call for papers, for example, they were taking a kind of quite a wide range of topics. So I think there's lots of scope for the smaller ones to maybe have some interesting kind of diverse voices as well. So yeah, definitely worth bearing in mind from a speaking perspective.
And I wouldn't overlook local and regional shows either. That these are ones you know your market, you know where your potential customers are. In the US, for example, I think there are state cybersecurity associations that run relatively large and often very interesting shows. So if you know that your market is in Maryland or Massachusetts, or you have a significant interest in doing business in Georgia, look and see what's going on in those states or in those regions. And I think the same principle applies internationally.
Yeah, definitely in the UK, we're seeing a lot of local events popping up outside of London. So I guess bearing in mind that if you don't want to pay those astronomical hotel fares that Rick mentioned right at the beginning of this talk, there's a lot of events now, for example, happening in Manchester, Leeds, in the north as well. So considering that, as John said, because you know that you might know that market a little bit more, it's probably less spread out than it is in the US. In the UK, we've got a much smaller footprint, but I am definitely seeing a lot more happening in different regions rather than it all just being focused on London.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we're seeing more on our side as well, particularly in Leeds. It seems like there's really a lot of innovation and companies choosing to station themselves there as well.
There's even a Cyber Scotland now, I saw, which with a few interesting companies popping up, I have to say. So it's just over in Glasgow, so I'm going to try and pop along to that one this year. But I would make also a plug. I have to make a plug, don't I? It's part of the same company. But I will make a plug for Black Hat. What's interesting about Black Hat, if anybody hasn't been along or doesn't know them very well, is that they very much started out on the practitioner side. It was less corporate. It's got more corporate, and I'll say that before John jumps in and because he's absolutely right. It has got more corporate, obviously. there's more stands, there's more companies trying to sell stuff like everywhere else. But it still retains a certain difference from, say, RSA, which is very businessy. And how can I put this nicely? There are more ponytails at Black Hat than there are at RSA. Let's put it that way. And probably more sandals and T-shirts with silly things written on them. So there's more of that practitioner element. Certainly the content of Black Hat is very interesting. You get some really like quite deep sessions that go way over my head about how to hack somebody's devices and all this good stuff. And the one thing I will say, which surprised me last year, was that I always thought that Black Hat USA was the largest in terms of sheer numbers of people, and it is. It's a respectable number. I mean, it's it's not a consumer show, 100,000 people or anything, but it is probably, I don't know, 40, 50, maybe 1,000 people. In fact, last year it was second to behind Black Hat Middle East and Asia, which takes place in Riyadh, I think, which was absolutely vast, and people were clamoring to get into it. I mean, my boss went along and she couldn't believe it. It was just a huge thing. Obviously, in that scenario, because there aren't a lot of other options to go to. So if you can get along to them, it's a great place to meet folks and talk about stuff, because there's an awful lot going on in that sector.
I think just to pick up on like the differences between Black Hat and RSA as well in terms of coverage, I would certainly consider how I'm covering the show in terms of, I'm thinking at Black Hat, I'm probably going to get more briefings that are a little bit more technical. So you consider that as well when you're planning what you're going to deliver. Are you going to take the most technical topics to RSA, or are you going to do that at Black Hat, RSA, do slightly softer briefings or have slightly softer news? Because that aligns better, and we're in the mindset of, I know it's evolved, as Rick said, but with Black Hat, you're like, okay, right, socks and sandals, we're on the practitioner side now. So that's how we're approaching the show as well. So I think that's something worth bearing in mind. I think we have less of that probably in the UK and Europe. But definitely in the US, those two they're serving slightly different purposes, even though one may be evolving to mirror the other somewhat.
I'd say from our perspective, one of the things that we try and do with our clients is really just source insight from across our client base, and put our clients in touch with each other as well, so that you can get feedback on events from your peers. So we run marketing swapping sessions, for example, throughout the year, and that gives people an opportunity to actually just come and find out what's working for other companies and learn from one another, because I think there's much more of a spirit of collaboration in the industry now, which is great. I think we've just about got time for one more question before we wrap up. So what type of pitches do you prioritise for meetings at show? I think we probably touched upon that a little bit earlier with what you're saying, John, in terms of embargoed news, but are there other things like trends, discussions, for example, or research that would hook you to want to speak to someone?
I've always found research interesting, so that would hook us. That's not true of every publication. That would have hooked me. Different people have different interests. The trends can be interesting, provided that there's some genuine insight there, that it's not simply a retailing of familiar conventional wisdom. And of course, embargoed news is always of interest.
Yeah, I would say the trends piece, leave that for later in the year. We're talking about trends all the time. So is it show specific? Unless you think, okay, I know, for example, RSA last year, AI, so perhaps it fits then, but I wouldn't say a generic trends piece is going to work well. And I see in the question, they've also said, my client is speaking, do you want to meet to discuss the topic? Actually, that could be quite a good way of saying, this is exactly what they're going to talk about. And often my team will go sit in that session, and then all they need is 5 minutes with that client afterwards to just ask 3 or 4 questions to get some exclusive quotes. So that can be a really good opportunity. So if you know that your client's speaking, you can share who it is, exactly what they're going to talk about, and then say, we'll have 5 minutes at the end once everyone's kind of left the stage, we'll meet nearby. And it makes it an opportunity for us to get some exclusive on top of the knowledge that we've already got. That person's already giving the briefing. So I think that's a really good opportunity as well, and makes it feel a bit more exclusive to the event. I'm at this event, I heard this person speak. It kind of helps with the story quite a lot there.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think then that takes us to time. So I'll say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, and Beth, Maundrill, Rick Turner, John Petrik, and of course Connor Heslin for joining. And thank you to everyone that's joined at home as well. We'll be developing lots more content on how companies can maximise their presence at trade shows that we'll be sharing across the Eskenzi LinkedIn. So please do follow us to get first access to that, and if you'd like to chat about how Eskenzi can support maximise your company's presence at trade shows and throughout the year, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you ever so much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
Upcoming trade shows, no doubt.
No doubt. Take care. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. Take care. Bye bye.